I have 3 children. Her voice cracks. Then she corrects herself softly. More. I have 3 more children. 3 more children to raise. For over a decade, the world clung to one polished version of Michael Jackson's death, a tidy narrative built on exhaustion, prescription drugs, and a single doctor who supposedly made one fatal mistake. But at 94 years old, his mother, Katherine Jackson, has finally begun to break the vow of silence she once swore she would keep. And what she allows herself to say now bears almost no resemblance to the story the public was given. Inside a modest room in her Encino home, the curtains drawn just enough to blur the California light, her hands tremble slightly in her lap. Her voice sits on the edge of a whisper as she leans forward, as if someone might still be listening from the hallway, and releases the words she has feared for nearly 15 years. Michael didn't die the way they told you. Behind that single, quiet sentence, she suggests, lives a structure of power Michael himself once referred to by a different name, the Circle. It was, he told her, a group that stayed close, but never visible, a presence he warned his mother about long before the world suspected anything. According to what Michael once confided, this circle watched him, tracked him, and nudged him deeper into a world he was beginning to realize he could no longer walk away from. He believed they monitored his deals, his interviews, even the way he moved in and out of rooms. This, Katherine insists, is not some wild superstition. It is, in her eyes, a mother finally describing the truth she feels she carried alone for years. The public story of Michael Jackson's downfall, she believes, did not begin in 2009 on a chaotic June morning. It started quietly, decades earlier. On the day he took control of something the music business never expected, a black artist, no matter how gifted, how adored, how successful, to ever own outright. The ATV Beatles catalog. In 1985, when a 27-year-old Michael signed the agreement that made him the owner of one of the most valuable publishing collections in American history, he stepped across a boundary that powerful men in suits had spent years keeping sealed. Insiders later said that line was never meant to be crossed by the talent. The moment his name went on those papers, the ground beneath him shifted in a way he could not yet see. The catalog was not just a trophy to hang on a wall. It was a throne. Inside it sat the blueprint for a huge part of the global music economy: song rights, licensing power, film synchronization deals, mechanical royalties, and leverage that would stretch decades into the future. It meant influence that ran from Hollywood boardrooms to private European investment meetings. And the fact that such a throne now belonged to a young black entertainer from Gary, Indiana, sent quiet shockwaves through an industry that had never planned for him to sit that high at the table. For years afterward, Katherine remembered a subtle but undeniable change in her son. She watched Michael's easy confidence begin to harden into caution. The bright joy that once filled his voice narrowed into something more guarded, more watchful. He had outbid people who were not accustomed to losing. He had claimed a prize that men twice his age, with 10 times his corporate access, had chased and negotiated over for decades. He had broken what many in the business believed was an unwritten rule. Artists could perform the music. They were not supposed to own the system that controlled it. And the punishment for crossing that invisible line did not arrive as lawsuits, public explosions, or open threats. It appeared as shadows, as silence, as a new tension in rooms that used to feel safe. Meetings suddenly took place behind closed doors. Michael would be invited in only after decisions were almost finished, as if his presence was a formality instead of authority. According to people who later spoke about that era, some executives invited him into those rooms simply to measure how much he understood and how much he did not. Michael's world after 1985 changed in ways the audience cheering in arenas could never see. The phone rang more often from unfamiliar numbers. Business partners who once spoke to him daily became distant, harder to reach. Executives who had piled praise on him in the early years began to shift with alarming speed from flattery to irritation, from warmth to something colder. The more Michael studied how publishing really worked, the more he realized exactly what he had stepped into. He had walked onto a battlefield without armor. The catalog made him untouchable in terms of creative power, but strangely exposed in every other way. In Hollywood, people had a saying, "You can be talented, you can be rich, but you cannot be sovereign." And Michael, by owning that catalog, had quietly become sovereign. Katherine saw the result each time he came home more withdrawn than before, each time he glanced over his shoulder in a room that used to feel like a refuge. The catalog, this crown he had fought to win, did not simply elevate him, it isolated him. It marked him. It turned him into the most powerful artist in the business, and at the same time, perhaps the most threatened. Behind the scenes, executives whispered that Michael had become too large to negotiate with, too unpredictable to manage, too independent to reliably control. The catalog had shifted him, in their eyes, from entertainer to force. And in industries built on control, forces must either be contained or removed. What the world applauded in 1985 as a genius move of business and ambition, Katherine quietly feared. She believed she saw what Michael didn't want to fully admit. He was holding something some people would rather see destroyed than allow him to keep. The catalog granted him unprecedented freedom, but it stripped away his sense of safety. It made him historic, but it also painted a target on his back. From that moment on, Katherine came to believe that every major battle Michael fought, every public scandal, every shadow that seemed to tighten around him could be traced back to that single choice in 1985, a decision that handed him a level of power many felt he was never supposed to possess. The world saw a triumph. Katherine saw the beginning of a hunt. The next chapter in Michael Jackson's downfall did not explode in a single scandal. It spread slowly, like a hairline crack across glass, nearly invisible at first, then impossible to ignore. From 1995 to 2003, Michael and Sony were bound together by a partnership that, on paper, looked perfectly balanced. 50% Sony, 50% Michael. To most observers, it seemed like a model of fairness, a rare case of an artist sharing real power with a corporation. But inside the boardrooms where the real conversations happened, that balance looked less like equality and more like a threat. To Sony, the ATV, Beatles' catalog was not just another line item, it was a kingdom. And in their view, Michael insisting on independence, questioning decisions, and guarding his ownership had become a king they could not fully command. During these years, the world saw what it thought was a seamless continuation of Michael's reign. Hit albums, packed arenas, record-breaking sales numbers flashing across screens. But behind the closed doors of executive suites, the atmosphere had cooled. There was a new edge in the air. Hosts who once greeted him with easy smiles now used politeness as cover for discomfort. Executives who used to flatter him with praise now watched him with measuring eyes. Michael was no longer the prodigy they could shape. He had studied the business from the inside. He knew the value of publishing, of masters, of ownership. He asked detailed questions about percentages, about clauses, about future rights. He had stepped out of the role of star and into the role of owner. And in an industry built on keeping artists uninformed, the moment an artist begins to truly understand the system, he becomes dangerous. Sony sought consolidation. Fewer variables, more control. Michael wanted something very different: sovereignty. He wanted the ability to decide the direction of his art and his business without being steered. The corporation preferred compliance. Michael demanded autonomy. With every negotiation, every reworked contract, every dispute over distribution or release strategy, the same fault line surfaced. They wanted the catalog back. He refused to loosen his grip. For him, it was never just about the money. It was about who held the future. The one who controlled publishing controlled leverage, catalog value, and long-term power. Michael's refusal to surrender that future disrupted a structure that depended on artists staying dependent. By 2001, the fractures were no longer hidden. Albums were delayed, budgets tightened, promotional campaigns scaled back without clear explanation. What looked like routine corporate decisions felt, from Michael's perspective, like a pressure campaign. It was not loud. It was not announced. It was a series of precise, quiet adjustments, just sharp enough to remind him that he was pushing against boundaries an artist was never supposed to approach. The silent war had begun. Then came 2002, The year silence shattered. In Harlem, standing before a crowd gathered for what was supposed to be a speech about community pride and unity, Michael did something virtually unheard of in his world. He pointed, not at rivals, not at tabloids, but at the very top of the corporate ladder. He called Sony's chairman a devil. The audience gasped. Some were stunned, some electrified. But the greater shock rippled miles away, through corporate corridors and executive phone lines. Inside the music industry, there is a code most artists learn early. You shield the powerful. Whatever their choices, whatever their methods, you do not expose them. You do not name them. You do not challenge them directly, and you certainly do not attack them in public. Michael broke that code in one sentence. What looked like a burst of anger to television viewers was seen very differently in upper offices. To them, this was not a wounded entertainer lashing out. It was a deliberate act of defiance, a superstar naming someone the industry treated like royalty. In that moment, Michael did more than burn a bridge. He struck at a rule carved deep into the foundation of the business. Powerful people may criticize artists. Artists do not criticize powerful people. The hierarchy exists to remain unquestioned. Katherine, watching the fallout, understood what her son had just triggered. She would later recall telling someone in private that Michael had crossed a line no one is supposed to cross. The conflict that had once been contained to negotiation tables and contract language was now visible. The war was no longer only on paper, it was out in the open. The pressure around him shifted form. Subtle internal resistance hardened into structural backlash, marketing campaigns scaled back, opportunities quietly withdrawn, support that once seemed automatic suddenly became conditional. Media narratives, which had wavered before, began tilting against him with uncanny timing. Stories that once might have been ignored or quietly corrected were amplified. Old rumors resurfaced in sharper tones. Coverage of him bent toward a single direction: undermine, doubt, destabilize. To the corporation, Michael had stopped functioning as a manageable asset. He looked more like a liability, a man who controlled too much, spoke too loudly, and refused to shrink when told to obey. Their partnership turned into something else entirely. A battleground hidden behind contracts, release schedules, and press statements. Between 1995 and 2003, Michael was not simply fighting over song rights or percentages on a balance sheet. He was fighting often alone for his survival inside a system that, according to people close to him, had never forgiven him for taking what many believed should have remained in their hands. In the end, the conflict was about far more than business. It was about punishment, and once that punishment mechanism was in motion, once the silent war turned into an open one, there was no easy way back. Long before tabloids splashed the word Illuminati across headlines, Michael Jackson had already named the force he said he feared most. He didn't call it magic. He didn't call it a cult. He didn't even use the word conspiracy. He called it the Circle. According to what he told people close to him, the Circle was not built on symbols or secret ceremonies, but on something far more ordinary and far more powerful: money, contracts, and absolute silence. In Michael's world, the Circle was not a myth, it was a structure. He described it as the unseen group sitting just behind the entertainment industry itself, never visible to fans, yet present in every boardroom where decisions about an artist's future were made. What made the Circle so terrifying, he believed, was not that it was invisible. It was that it was made of very real people. In his description, the Circle included entertainment executives managing billion-dollar catalogs, investors funding global arena tours, media moguls shaping the public narrative around artists, and legal advisors whose signatures could outweigh talent, truth, or justice. Their identities were not scrawled in secret ledgers. They were printed on glass office doors, embossed on awards, listed on resumes that lined entire walls. They moved the industry the way wind moves a ship quietly, but with enough force to change an entire direction. Throughout the late 1992s and early 2000s, Katherine watched her son grow increasingly wary of this invisible architecture. He understood, perhaps more clearly than most, how the machine around him worked. These were the people who, in his view, decided which albums received marketing budgets and which were starved. Which artists had their missteps quietly buried and which were dragged into the spotlight as public warnings? Which scandals disappeared overnight and which were magnified until they broke someone? The circle, as Michael described it, rewarded obedience with superstardom and answered independence with slow, methodical destruction. They did not need overt violence. They had influence. Influence that could rewrite contracts, restructure debt, and quietly separate an artist from the allies who kept them stable. Their favorite tool, insiders later claimed, was leverage the ability to turn an artist's own success or their own financial vulnerability into a point of control. Behind the curtain, it was said that the circle operated through patterns the public never got to see. One of the most chilling was something industry whisperers called strategic suppression, the quiet burial of a project without ever admitting it. Marketing budgets would be quietly reduced. Release dates would be pushed back without warning. Negative stories would surface in just the right outlets at just the right time. Michael reportedly felt this after the release of Invincible in 2001. Despite costing more than $30 million to create, the album received a fraction of the promotional support his earlier work had enjoyed. To fans, it looked like a strange oversight. Inside the business, some described it as a message, a controlled cooling meant to remind him that no matter how large his name loomed, in their hierarchy, it still sat below theirs. Another tactic was what some lawyers and insiders referred to as legal entanglement. Attorneys with close ties to major record companies were known, according to reports, to slip dense clauses into contracts, language that expanded corporate control while quietly shrinking the artist's independence. Katherine would later hear that Michael's later deals contained precisely these pressure points, provisions that could be triggered to tighten financial control if he became difficult or resistant. Even for someone with Michael's resources, fighting those clauses was almost impossible. They were built to drain time and money, two things artists burn through faster than they realize. The circle also, according to media insiders, controlled what could be called narrative engineering. Powerful figures who owned key media platforms could elevate a reputation or dismantle it with a single, coordinated shift in coverage. When Michael publicly criticized powerful executives in 2002, the tone in major outlets turned with uncanny speed. Small missteps morphed into major headlines, old accusations resurfaced with renewed aggression. Stories once dismissed as noise began to form a pattern aimed at destabilizing him. To outsiders, it might have looked like coincidence. To those who watched the timing up close, it felt like choreography. Perhaps the most suffocating tactic, though, was something insiders privately labeled professional isolation. Key collaborators were quietly steered away. Producers who had once waited eagerly for a call suddenly became too busy. Agents who had chased him for years stopped returning messages. Potential partnerships evaporated without explanation. Nothing needed to be said to his face. The distance spoke for them. It was, in Katherine's eyes, the circle tightening around him, not with visible threats, but with surgical precision, until even the spaces that once felt open began to close in. Her comment that they control money, contracts, and silence was not meant as poetry. To her, it was a literal description. The circle, as she understood it from Michael's fears and her own observations, controlled the financial structures artists depended on, the paperwork that defined their futures, and the unspoken pact that kept insiders from ever revealing too much. And the most disturbing realization in her mind was this: the circle did not need to harm artists physically. All it had to do was make them small enough, tired enough, desperate enough, and alone enough that collapse would come on its own. They could raise a star with a single unified decision. They could dismantle one just as quickly. In Michael's case, his genius made him untouchable in the eyes of the public, but his insistence on independence made him intolerable to certain powers in private. The circle did not crash into his life out of nowhere. It tightened around him gradually, intentionally, methodically, and by the time he truly understood how deep that structure ran, it was already too late. He was surrounded. Chapter 4. The Trap. This is it. By 2008, Michael Jackson had reached a place almost no other global icon had ever stood. To millions, he remained a legend, an untouchable figure whose name still filled stadiums and headlines. But behind the high walls of his Las Vegas residence, the reality was starkly different. Privately, he was drowning. Inside that house, the warning signs had been flashing for months. Unpaid loans stacking up, abandoned ventures bleeding money, unresolved tax disputes, lawsuits piling one on top of another, and the lingering, enormous cost of maintaining Neverland, even in its quiet decline. It was a slow-moving crisis, visible only to the people close enough to see the numbers. In October 2008, auditors combed through his accounts and, according to later reports, delivered a brutal conclusion. Without either a massive comeback or the liquidation of major assets, Michael would face financial collapse within a year. It sounded like advice. It felt like a verdict. Because to those who understood the way the industry works, that kind of warning does something else. It creates leverage. Once a performer becomes financially vulnerable, the people who stand to gain from a comeback often step forward not simply as rescuers, but as designers, architects of what comes next. That opportunity appeared when AEG Live entered the story. They presented a proposal that, on the surface, sounded like salvation: a comeback residency in London. A series of shows grand enough to restore his finances, rebuild his reputation, and reintroduce him to the world as the King of Pop reborn. The initial number 10 shows at the O2 Arena felt manageable, almost compassionate, as if the plan had been tailored to his condition. But that number did not stay small. Behind closed doors, in meeting rooms Michael did not attend, the figure began to climb. According to documents later referenced in court and reports, 10 quietly became 31, then 50. At one point, internal discussions allegedly floated the possibility of 80 and even 120 shows spanning multiple continents. These expansions were not announced with dramatic press conferences. They slipped in through memos, contract revisions, and investor briefings that did not require Michael's signature in the room to be discussed. Every increase meant more. More ticket revenue, more merchandise, more licensing, more film and streaming opportunities. For the promoters and investors, each added show represented another vein of income. But for Michael, it meant something else, more physical strain for a man already battling insomnia, anxiety, and a body frayed by years of stress. More pressure on a nervous system held together by exhaustion and medication. The true engine of This Is It did not begin with Michael's dream of returning to the stage. It began, according to internal accounts, in meetings he did not initiate. On the 22nd of December 2008, in a closed-door gathering at the Beverly Hills Hotel, a group of 4 executives, 3 investors, and 2 legal representatives reportedly sat around a long polished table and discussed what some called the MJ Recovery Plan. On paper, it was a blueprint. In spirit, it treated Michael less like a person and more like an asset to be rebooted. The conversation, according to notes later examined, revolved around revenue streams, insurance coverage, risk mitigation, and an expanding show schedule. His well-being appeared only once, buried in a small notation: health concerns to be addressed with private physician. One sterile line. But that line would lead directly to one of the most fatal details of all. Another key meeting followed on the 5th of March 2009 at AEG's offices in downtown Los Angeles, timed roughly 6 hours before Michael would step onto a stage at London's O2 Arena and tell the world, "This is it." Documents later revealed that by the time he walked out under those bright lights, promoters had already instructed marketing teams to prepare campaigns built around at least 50 shows. The scale of the operation had been decided before Michael ever looked into the cameras. The crowd that day screamed and clapped, the flashes exploded from every angle. He smiled, joked, and repeated the phrase the press would replay for months. This is it. But if you watch the footage closely, you can see something else. A flicker in his eyes, a stiffness in his shoulders, a hesitation in his body, as if he were pushing against something only he could feel. It was the look of a man who understood, on some level, that he had stepped into a structure he might not be able to step out of. That same night, Katherine Jackson would remember receiving a phone call she would never forget. Michael's voice sounded thin, strained, almost hollow. He told her he was exhausted. He hadn't slept properly in months. The mixture of anxiety, physical breakdown, and the weight of a commitment that no longer felt humanly possible had settled over him like concrete. Behind the scenes, the pressure only grew heavier. Every time Michael voiced discomfort, asked for changes, or showed signs that the schedule was more than he could carry, the machine did not slow. It tightened. Rehearsals lengthened. Expectations rose. The deadlines remained fixed. Performance insurance investigators were dispatched to watch him, to observe his stamina, his clarity, his ability to endure what had been promised to the world. Each stumble increased the pressure. Each good rehearsal was used as justification to push him harder. As spring slid into summer, the rehearsal schedule began to look less like preparation and more like a test of survival. On the 11th of June, 2009, inside the Staples Center, cameras captured him struggling with choreography that, years earlier, had seemed to defy gravity. Dancers later described in hushed tones how sometimes Michael moved as if he were fighting an invisible weight, as though gravity itself had doubled. On June 19, director Kenny Ortega reportedly documented concerns in internal notes, describing Michael as incoherent and unfit to perform. It was the kind of alarm that should have stopped everything, but it didn't. Money was already in motion. Contracts had already been executed. Insurance policies had already been calculated. The gears of the tour had locked into place. And large machines, once activated, rarely stop for human limits. What investigators later found in contractual drafts was even more unsettling. The agreements did not simply reflect the 50 shows the public had heard about. They included options for world tours, extended residencies, documentary rights, merchandise expansions, and more, built around the assumption that Michael would continue performing far beyond what his body could realistically sustain. It was not just a tour. It was a long-term pipeline, a system of projected revenue that depended on him staying upright, compliant, and working. But by that point, Michael was none of those things. He wasn't upright. He was dangerously depleted. He wasn't compliant. He was anxious, resistant, afraid. He wasn't capable. His body was signaling collapse. By June 2009, according to various medical accounts, he had gone through stretches of sleeplessness that would have pushed most people to the edge of psychological and physical breakdown. His reliance on drug-induced unconsciousness had deepened. His private physician was administering medications designed for operating rooms, not for bedrooms, not for a home. And still, the machine rolled forward. One of the most haunting details to Katherine lay not in what was written in black ink, but in what seemed deliberately blurred. Who exactly had approved the escalating number of shows? The documents were vague. Signatures appeared from intermediaries, from departments, from representatives. No single person or office seemed to stand fully behind the decision. Responsibility appeared to have been spread so thin across the network that it became almost impossible to trace. It was as if the decision had been dissolved into the structure itself. Michael found himself attached to schedules and obligations he never entirely understood, bound to commitments that grew heavier every time someone else decided to increase the scale. He had not walked into a simple comeback. He had walked into something that looked, from the outside, like opportunity, and from the inside, like entrapment. It was not a return. It was a countdown. A countdown designed by people who, in Katherine's view, saw profit where they should have seen pain, who needed him present, rehearsing, performing, pushing long after his body had begun to fail him. They did not need him well. They only needed him working. Chapter 5. 48 Hours Before Death. Tragedy almost never begins with a single, sudden blow. It builds quietly, layer by layer, through ignored warnings, strange patterns, and pressures no one wants to face until they no longer have a choice. In Michael Jackson's case, everything converged inside a narrow, cruel window, the final 48 hours of his life. The dates June 23 and June 24, 2009, now sit in modern music history like a dark watermark, reconstructed piece by piece from rehearsal footage, security timestamps, medical notes, and fragmented memories from those who were nearby. When these scattered pieces are laid side by side, they do not form a clean, linear story. They form something else, a jagged, chilling mosaic of a man being pulled apart by forces far larger than he was ever meant to carry. On June 23, 2009, Los Angeles baked under early summer heat. Inside the glowing steel shell of the Staples Center, the final rehearsals for This Is It moved forward under the bright stage lights. Michael arrived, visibly reduced. He looked painfully thin, his frame shrunken beneath his clothes. His hand trembled in faint, almost invisible spasms, as if he was fighting an internal storm no one else could see. His head dipped repeatedly, and his eyes seemed to drift, struggling to lock onto anything in front of him. Dancers on set would later recall that he moved as though the air itself had turned heavy, as if every step required more than his body had left to give. It looked like he was holding himself upright by will alone. Footage captured during that night shows a small but revealing moment. Michael missteps, loses his balance, and reaches out, catching himself against a dancer's arm. To someone unfamiliar with his usual precision, it might have looked like simple fatigue. To the people who knew his body, it looked like the edge of collapse. Even in that condition, he pushed through the night. The rehearsal went on. It ended at around 12:30 a.m. on June 24th. Michael was then driven back to the Holmby Hills residence in a silence that felt more strained than peaceful. By then, his bedroom no longer resembled a place of rest. It had effectively become a makeshift procedure room, IV lines, a blood pressure monitor, scattered syringes, vials of benzodiazepines, and a bottle of propofol reportedly lacking proper hospital labeling. A man who, according to later accounts, had not slept naturally in nearly 60 days, was now relying on an anesthetic designed for operating rooms, not for nightly use in a private home. The show demanded that he rise again the next day. His body could not. The morning of June 24th drifted by uneasily. Michael barely ate. His fluid intake was dangerously low. Medical notes attributed to Dr. Conrad Murray would later describe irregular heart rhythms, severe fatigue, and signs of profound stress symptoms that should have brought any performance schedule to an immediate halt. But the rehearsals did not stop. That night, more footage shows his left hand shaking violently for several seconds. His eyes float, unfocused. His movements remain sharp in form, but disconnected in spirit, as though his mind and body were no longer in agreement. Observers described him afterward as a man pushing far beyond what any human should attempt. Still, no one stepped in to shut it down. The tour could not stop. The promoters could not stop. The investors would not stop. The machine did not stop. And the machine required Michael to keep moving, even as it was clearly breaking him. This was the trap he could no longer escape. He was not rehearsing out of excitement or creative hunger. He rehearsed because he was bound locked into obligations larger and heavier than his failing health could carry. The early hours of June 25th fell over the house like a curtain. Security footage recorded Dr. Murray moving in and out of Michael's room between roughly 1:00 a.m. and 4:00 a.m. Multiple sedatives were administered, benzodiazepines such as lorazepam and midazolam, and finally propofol, a powerful anesthetic that requires advanced monitoring and resuscitation equipment. None of the usual safeguards were there. No crash cart, no EKG monitor tracking his heart, no proper backup oxygen system. It was not true medical care. It was, in effect, a lethal gamble balancing between induced unconsciousness and the risk of never waking up. At around 10:40 a.m., Murray would later state that Michael stopped responding. That moment marks the beginning of the darkest fracture in the entire timeline. From 10:40 a.m. until 12:21 p.m., the record twists into a void, a 101-minute gap that has never been fully clarified. Witness statements conflicted. Reports shifted over time. Some people claimed Murray panicked, dropping equipment, pacing, unsure of what to do. Others believed he may have tried to clean or rearrange the scene before anyone else saw it. What is certain is this. For nearly 2 hours, no emergency call was made, no security alert was sounded, no outside medical help was requested while there was still a chance to reverse what was happening. That silence, that void, haunted Katherine Jackson. Through years of revisiting documents, recordings, and courtroom testimony, that 101-minute stretch grew in her mind into more than just a missing piece. It became a wound where the truth should have lived. She would later refer to it privately as the silence zone, a period in which answers might have existed, but nothing honest was allowed to surface. Not because no one knew anything, she believed, but because the ones who knew would not speak. At 12:21 p.m., the 911 call was finally placed. The dispatcher's voice, captured on audio, was unnervingly calm. The person calling sounded oddly composed, for someone reporting that a man was not breathing. Paramedics arrived at approximately 12:26 p.m. It took them only seconds to understand that Michael had likely been in cardiac arrest far too long. They worked on him for more than 40 minutes, fighting against a reality that had already settled into the room before their arrival. He was transported from the Holmby Hills residence and taken to UCLA Medical Center, where at 2:26 p.m. on the 25th of June, 2009, Michael Jackson was officially pronounced dead. When those final 48 hours are viewed as a whole, a devastating pattern emerges. Michael did not die in a single chaotic instant. He died inside a slow, relentless collapse built over time through exhaustion, toxic cycles of medication, escalating external pressure, and the quiet cooperation of people who needed him functioning more than they needed him protected. The circle, in Katherine's eyes, never had to lay a visible hand on him. All it had to do was allow the system around him to keep operating exactly as it was, without correction, without interruption, without mercy. This is it did not kill Michael Jackson. The unspoken reality inside those final 48 hours did. And once the silence closed in around him, nothing was strong enough to break it open again. Chapter 6. Who benefited? In tragedies shaped by power, the truth rarely appears through heartfelt statements. More often, it reveals itself through one cold, undeniable trail: the movement of money. In the hours and days after Michael Jackson's death, the industry's response unfolded with a speed and precision that felt less like shock and more like activation, as if a long, silent plan had just been triggered. According to public records and reports, less than 30 days after he was pronounced dead at UCLA Medical Center, Sony finalized one of the largest recording deals in music history. The contract, reportedly worth around $250 million, covered posthumous albums, documentaries, and archival projects. Deals of that magnitude do not appear out of thin air. They require internal modeling, legal drafting, strategic planning, and multiple levels of corporate approval. Yet somehow, the agreement was signed and sealed almost immediately after his passing. By 2010, the documentary This Is It had generated over $260 million worldwide. What had originally been raw rehearsal footage, scenes that some insiders quietly described as uncomfortable and deeply haunting, was reframed and released as a triumphant farewell. Audiences cheered at moments that, behind closed doors, had once troubled dancers, choreographers,